I didn't walk into the museum expecting anything unusual. Honestly, I just needed quiet. Life had been loud lately, not in the dramatic movie scene kind of way, but in the constant hum of pressure, deadlines, conversations that never felt finished. The kind of noise that settles inside your chest even when the room around you is silent. Museums were my escape. They slowed everything down, forced people to observe instead of react. And that morning, I needed to observe. The building itself felt peaceful the moment I stepped through the glass doors. Cool air brushed against my face, and the sound of the city faded behind me like someone turning down the volume on a speaker. Inside, people moved slowly. Soft footsteps, quiet conversations, the occasional echo of a child asking questions too loudly before being gently shushed. I bought my ticket and slipped it into my jacket pocket, nodding politely at the receptionist before heading toward the main exhibition hall. The exhibit focused on innovation, stories of individuals who shaped history through ideas most people never learned about in school. I took my time, reading every plaque, studying each photograph. My grandfather used to tell me, "History rewards patience." He taught me to look for the details others miss. And that's what I was doing when I heard them. A man's voice first, not loud, but sharp enough to cut through the quiet atmosphere. "I mean, come on," he said. "They're clearly trying too hard with this." A woman laughed softly beside him. "Yeah, everything has to be inclusive now." My shoulders stiffened slightly. I didn't turn, not yet. Instead, I stayed focused on the display in front of me, a timeline of early technological advancements, while listening carefully. The couple stood a few feet away, near an exhibit highlighting contributions from Black inventors. "I doubt half this stuff is accurate," the man said. That sentence hit differently, not because it was new, but because it was familiar. I've heard that tone my entire life. The quiet dismissal disguised as skepticism. The assumption that stories involving people who look like me must somehow be exaggerated. I took a slow breath. I could walk away. Most days, I would. But something about that moment felt different. Maybe it was the setting. Maybe it was the fact that we were standing in a place dedicated to learning. And yet, they chose ignorance. Or maybe I was just tired of silence pretending to be peace. I stepped closer to the exhibit they were mocking. Not confrontationally, just present. Close enough that my voice would carry naturally if I spoke. I began reading aloud softly. "This engineer developed early safety systems still used today," I said calmly. They stopped talking. The man turned toward me slowly. "Oh yeah?" he said, smiling in a way that wasn't quite friendly. "That's what they say." I met his gaze briefly. "It's also documented in engineering journals." His expression shifted, not angry, just surprised. "You an expert or something?" I hesitated, not because I didn't know what to say, because I knew how moments like this could go. People rarely change when they feel attacked. "I study history," I said simply. His wife crossed her arms. "Well, history gets rewritten all the time." "Yes," I agreed gently. That caught them off guard. They expected resistance, argument. Instead, I nodded. "It does get rewritten," I continued. "But rewriting doesn't always mean exaggerating." I pointed toward the display. "Sometimes it means finally telling the full story." Silence settled between us. And for the first time, the man looked back at the exhibit with real attention. Not dismissal, curiosity. And that's when I realized something important. This wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about opening a door. The moment shifted after I spoke. not dramatically. Not in the loud, confrontational way people imagine when they think about conflict. It was quieter than that. The man didn't argue immediately. Instead, he looked back at the exhibit more carefully, like he was seeing it for the first time, not just glancing at it, but actually reading. That surprised me. Most people double down when they feel challenged. They defend their pride before they defend their beliefs. But he paused. And that pause told me something important. This wasn't going to be a shouting match. At least, not yet. His wife, though, reacted differently. She tilted her head slightly, studying me in a way that felt familiar. The kind of look I've received countless times in my life. Curiosity mixed with judgment, like she was trying to place me into a category she already understood. "So you just walk around correcting people?" she asked. Her tone wasn't aggressive, but it carried an edge. I smiled gently. "No," I said. "I just care about accuracy." The man let out a small laugh. "Well, accuracy depends on who writes history." "That's true," I replied calmly. "And that's exactly why context matters." I pointed toward the display again. This engineer's work was ignored for decades, not because it wasn't important, but because recognition wasn't distributed equally. The man crossed his arms. "You're saying history is biased." "I'm saying history reflects power," I answered. Silence followed. A few nearby visitors slowed down, pretending to read displays while clearly listening. I felt their attention, but I didn't focus on it. My goal wasn't an audience. My goal was clarity. The wife sighed softly. "It just feels like everything these days is about race," she said. There it was, not loud, not openly hostile, but familiar. I took a slow breath. "That's because race has always been part of history," I said gently. "We're just talking about it more openly now." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced around the room, maybe noticing the attention we were starting to draw. The man leaned closer to the display again. "So, you're saying this guy actually changed transportation systems?" "Yes," I said, "and not just transportation. Safety protocols that saved lives." He frowned slightly. "That's not what I learned in school." I nodded. That's the point. He didn't argue. He just stood there quietly. And in that silence, I felt something shift. Not agreement, but curiosity. That's when the museum guide approached. She had been watching from a distance. I could tell by the way she smiled slightly at me before addressing the couple. "Are you enjoying the exhibit?" she asked politely. The man hesitated. "Yeah, it's interesting," he admitted. She nodded enthusiastically. "This section focuses on overlooked innovators. Many of their contributions were excluded from early textbooks." He glanced at me briefly, then back at her. "So, this is all verified?" "Yes," she said, "extensively." The confirmation changed something, not because I needed validation, but because hearing it from an authority figure they trusted seemed to carry different weight. The wife shifted uncomfortably. "Well, I guess we didn't know," she said quietly. And that's when I noticed something deeper. This wasn't just ignorance. It was unfamiliarity. The difference matters. Ignorance can learn. Prejudice defends itself. I decided to push slightly further, not aggressively, just enough. "Can I show you something?" I asked. They exchanged a quick glance. Then the man nodded. I guided them toward another exhibit, one highlighting early patents from Black inventors, rows of names, diagrams, documents. "This is part of what's called hidden history," I explained. "Not hidden intentionally all the time, but hidden through omission." The wife studied the display. Her expression softened slightly. "I never saw this before," she said. "That's common," I replied. She looked at me again, this time with less defensiveness. "But why didn't schools teach this?" I smiled faintly. "That's a long conversation." The man chuckled. "Sounds like you've had it before." "Many times," I admitted, "and for the first time since the interaction began." He laughed with me instead of at me. The tension eased slightly, but then he said something that shifted the atmosphere again. "I just don't think people today should feel guilty for the past." There it was, the real issue beneath the surface. I nodded slowly. "I agree," I said. They both looked surprised. "But understanding history isn't about guilt," I continued. "It's about awareness." The wife tilted her head. "What's the difference?" "Guilt looks backward," I said. "Awareness looks forward." Silence settled again, and I could see them thinking, really thinking, not reacting. That's when I knew this interaction wasn't over. Not even close. Because the real lesson hadn't started yet. And I hadn't even told them who I really was. The air between us changed after that moment. Not dramatically, not in a way most people would notice. But I felt it. The man wasn't dismissing the exhibit anymore. He leaned closer, reading carefully, his earlier confidence replaced by something quieter. Curiosity mixed with uncertainty. His wife still stood with her arms crossed, but even she seemed less defensive now, her eyes moving slowly across the display instead of skimming past it. That was the first real shift. People rarely admit they were wrong immediately. But when they start asking questions instead of making statements, that's when something begins to move. "So," the man said finally, glancing at me, "you said you study history?" "Yes." "What kind of history?" I paused for a moment, not because I didn't know the answer, because I knew the answer would change how they saw me. "American cultural history," I said, "and specifically, overlooked contributions." He nodded slowly. That makes sense. The way he said it told me something. He wasn't arguing anymore. He was recalibrating. His wife tilted her head slightly. "You must get tired of correcting people," she said. I smiled faintly. "I don't correct people," I replied gently. "I share information." She gave a small, skeptical smile. "That sounds like correcting." "Maybe," I admitted. "But intent matters." Silence settled again. Nearby visitors moved around us, occasionally glancing over, sensing that something interesting was happening without fully understanding what. The man looked back at the display. "I just don't like feeling like I'm being blamed for things that happened before I was born," he said suddenly. There it was. The deeper layer beneath everything, not just dismissal, discomfort. I nodded slowly. "I understand that," I said. He looked surprised. "You do?" "Yes," I replied. Because history conversations often get framed emotionally instead of educationally. His wife shifted slightly. "So you're not saying people today should feel guilty?" "No," I said calmly. "I'm saying people today should feel informed." That distinction hung in the air. The man exhaled slowly. "That's different from how it usually sounds." "I know," I said, and I meant it. Because most conversations about race and history start with tension. People enter them expecting attack or defense. Very few enter expecting understanding. I pointed toward another section of the exhibit. "Let me show you something." They hesitated briefly, then followed. We stopped at a display featuring original patent documents, real signatures, technical diagrams, proof. These inventions weren't ignored because they lacked value, I said quietly. They were ignored because recognition wasn't distributed equally. The wife leaned closer. You mean racism? Yes, I said simply. No accusation, just fact. She nodded slowly, absorbing it. And then she said something that changed everything. I never thought about it like that. Her voice wasn't defensive anymore. It sounded honest. And that honesty shifted something inside me too. Because suddenly, this wasn't just about teaching. It was about connection. The man studied another plaque carefully. I feel like we were never taught this, he said. That's common, I replied. But absence of knowledge isn't proof something didn't happen. He laughed softly. That's fair. We walked slowly through the exhibit together, and the conversation felt less like confrontation and more like exploration. But then, something changed again. A group of teenagers walked past us. One of them glanced at me and said quietly to his friend, "He probably works here." It wasn't loud, but I heard it, and so did the couple. The man looked at me quickly, embarrassed. I smiled faintly. "I don't work here," I said. The teenager turned red and walked away quickly. The moment passed, but it revealed something deeper. Assumptions, automatic ones, and I saw the couple noticing it too. The wife cleared her throat. "That must happen a lot," she said quietly. "Yes," I replied, "and it's usually not intentional." The man shook his head slightly. "I guess we all make assumptions." "Yes," I said, "we do." And then I decided it was time. Time to change the power dynamic completely. Time for them to understand who I really was, because until now, they thought I was just another visitor, another stranger offering opinions. They didn't realize yet that I wasn't just studying history. I was part of it. I could feel the moment approaching, not a dramatic explosion, not some cinematic reveal where everything stops and people gasp. Something quieter, more powerful. Because up until now, they thought I was just another visitor, someone opinionated, maybe well-read, maybe passionate. They didn't realize yet that I wasn't just discussing history. I was connected to it. And that connection was about to change everything. The man continued studying the exhibit in silence. His earlier confidence had faded into curiosity. His wife leaned closer to read a plaque again, this time slowly, her lips moving slightly as she followed the words. It was a small detail, but important. People read differently when they're trying to understand instead of trying to disagree. "You know," the man said finally, "I never thought about how much gets left out of textbooks." I nodded. "That's normal." "Why is that?" he asked. "Because history isn't just about what happened," I said. "It's about who gets remembered." He frowned slightly, thinking. His wife glanced at me again, studying me in a way that felt less judgmental now and more curious. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." "Why do you care so much about this?" The question hung between us. It wasn't hostile. It was honest. And it was the opening I had been waiting for. I took a slow breath. "Because these stories aren't abstract to me," I said quietly. They both looked at me more closely. "What do you mean?" the man asked. I turned slightly toward another display, one I had passed earlier but intentionally saved. "This exhibit," I said, gesturing gently, "features contributions from early Black engineers whose work shaped modern infrastructure." They followed me as I walked toward it. The museum felt quieter suddenly, like the rest of the room faded into background noise. We stopped in front of a large photograph, an old black and white image of a group of men standing beside early transportation machinery. The plaque beneath it listed names, dates, achievements. I pointed toward one name, That's my grandfather. Silence, heavy, unexpected. The man blinked. His wife looked at me quickly, then back at the photograph. Wait, she said slowly. You mean, actually? Yes. Their expressions changed immediately, not just surprise, something deeper, recognition. The power dynamic shifted without me raising my voice or changing my tone, because suddenly, this wasn't theoretical. This wasn't a debate. This was personal. I grew up hearing stories about him, I continued calmly. How he worked twice as hard to receive half the recognition. How his contributions were often credited to others. They listened quietly, no interruptions, no defensive comments, just listening. And that alone felt significant. I used to come to this museum with my grandfather, I added. He'd stand in front of exhibits and tell me what was missing. The man swallowed slightly. What was missing? He asked. Names, I said. Context, credit. His wife looked down briefly and back at the plaque. I didn't realize, she said softly. I nodded gently. Most people don't. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It felt reflective. The man rubbed the back of his neck. I guess earlier we were dismissive. He didn't say racist. He didn't need to. I know, I said calmly. And I understand why. They both looked surprised. You do? The wife asked. Yes, I replied. Because when people grow up with incomplete history, they assume the gaps mean nothing happened. The man nodded slowly. That makes sense. And then something unexpected happened. He looked at me differently, not as someone challenging him, not as someone opposing him, but as someone teaching him. Respect entered his posture quietly. The wife took a small step closer to the exhibit. So when people talk about representation, this is what they mean? Yes, I said. It's not about replacing history. It's about completing it. She nodded slowly, and I could see something shifting behind her eyes. Understanding. Not perfect. Not complete, but beginning. A group of visitors walked past us, glancing at the exhibit and then at us. The museum guide watched from a distance, smiling slightly. The man turned back toward me. I think I owe you an apology, he said. His voice sounded genuine. For earlier, I paused. This was an important moment because the lesson wasn't about shame. It was about awareness. You don't owe me anything, I said gently. But you do owe history curiosity. He smiled slightly. That's fair. But the lesson wasn't finished yet, because something deeper still needed to happen. They needed to understand not just facts, but impact. And that moment was coming. After I told them my grandfather's name was on that exhibit, the atmosphere shifted in a way that was impossible to ignore. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was real. The man stopped talking completely for a moment, his eyes moving slowly between me and the photograph, like he was trying to reassemble everything he thought he understood about the situation. His wife's posture softened. Her arms, which had been crossed almost the entire time, slowly relaxed at her sides. People don't always realize how much body language reveals before words do. And right then, their bodies told me they were listening differently. Not defending, not dismissing. Listening. That must feel strange, the wife said finally. What do you mean? I asked gently. She hesitated. Seeing someone in your family recognized like this, after everything you said about being overlooked. I nodded slowly. It's complicated, I admitted. When I was younger, my grandfather used to walk me through exhibits like this and point out what was missing. The man glanced back at the plaque. And now he's included. Yes, I said, but inclusion doesn't erase what happened before. They both nodded quietly. I could see them thinking, not just about the exhibit, but about their earlier comments, and that silence felt heavier than any argument. We stood there together for a while, reading. No one rushed to fill the quiet. And in that stillness, something important happened. The man leaned closer toward the display, tracing one of the diagrams with his finger without touching the glass. "He helped design this?" he asked. "Yes." "That's impressive." The words sounded sincere, not performative. And that sincerity mattered. Because change doesn't come from being embarrassed. It comes from curiosity. The wife turned toward me again. "I think earlier, we spoke without understanding," she said softly. Her tone wasn't defensive. It sounded reflective. "I know," I replied gently. "And I appreciate you saying that." The man exhaled slowly. "It's just, sometimes it feels like people want to make everything about race," he said. There it was again. But this time, it sounded less like resistance and more like confusion. I nodded. "That feeling is common," I said, "but often it comes from only seeing part of the conversation." He looked at me, waiting. "When history includes everyone," I continued, "it doesn't make things about race. It just makes the truth more complete." He considered that for a long moment. His wife studied another photograph nearby. "You said you came here with your grandfather?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "Every summer when I was a kid." "What did he tell you?" she asked quietly. I smiled slightly. "He used to say museums aren't just about what you see. They're about what you're ready to learn." The man chuckled softly. "That sounds like something my grandfather would say." The tension eased a little more, and for the first time, it felt like we were just three people sharing a conversation, not opponents standing on opposite sides. But then something happened that deepened the moment. A young black boy walked into the exhibit with his mother. He stopped in front of the same photograph and pointed excitedly. "Mom, he looks like us." His voice carried across the room. The mother smiled warmly. "Yes, he does." The boy's eyes lit up. "He's famous." "Yes," she said gently. "He helped build things that changed the world." I glanced at the couple. They watched quietly. The man's expression shifted, thoughtful, almost emotional. He turned toward me slowly. "I never thought about how important it is for kids to see themselves in history," he admitted. "That moment right there," I said softly, nodding toward the boy, "is why representation matters." The wife's eyes softened. "It's not about replacing anyone," she said quietly, almost to herself. "It's about adding." I smiled gently. "Exactly." The realization settled over them slowly. Not forced, not defensive, just understanding growing naturally. The man shook his head slightly. "I feel embarrassed about what I said earlier." "You don't need to feel embarrassed," I replied calmly. "Learning moments only matter if you stay open to them." He nodded slowly. And for a moment, we just stood there together, watching the boy continue reading the exhibit with excitement. And that's when I knew something important. The lesson wasn't about proving them wrong. It wasn't about making them feel guilty. It was about giving them a new lens, one that allowed them to see what had always been there. But the real turning point, the moment that would stay with all of us long after we left the museum, was still coming. After the boy and his mother walked away, the silence between us felt different, not heavy, not uncomfortable, just reflective. The man watched them go, his expression thoughtful, almost distant. "I never really thought about that," he said quietly. "What?" I asked. "How important it is for kids to see people who look like them in history." I nodded. Most people don't notice what's missing until they finally see it included. His wife exhaled slowly. I think earlier, we were reacting instead of listening, she said. Her voice sounded softer than before, not defensive, not embarrassed, just honest. That's normal, I replied gently. People react based on what they already know. And we didn't know much, she admitted. The man laughed lightly, though it sounded more like self-awareness than humor. Yeah, clearly. We began walking slowly toward another section of the exhibit together. The conversation felt calmer now, less like a debate and more like exploration. But beneath that calmness, something deeper was forming. A shift that hadn't fully surfaced yet. We stopped in front of a display featuring personal stories, letters, journal entries, photographs, real lives, not just achievements. This section focuses on personal experiences behind innovation, I said. They wanted to show the human side of history. The wife leaned closer to read one of the letters. Her expression softened. He wrote about not being allowed into certain buildings even after inventing something important, she said quietly. Yes, I replied. Recognition didn't always equal acceptance. She shook her head slightly. That must have been exhausting. I hesitated before answering. It was, I said. And sometimes, it still is. They both looked at me more closely. Not just at my words, but at me. And I knew the moment had arrived, the deeper truth. Because up until now, we had been talking about history like something distant, something finished. But history isn't finished. It lives inside people, inside experiences. I didn't just learn about this from books, I said quietly. The man's posture straightened slightly. What do you mean? I paused, choosing my words carefully. My grandfather wasn't the only one who experienced being overlooked, I continued. I have too. Silence. The museum around us faded again into background noise. The wife's eyes softened. In what way? She asked gently. I took a slow breath. Moments where people assume I don't belong in certain spaces, I said. Moments where people question my knowledge before hearing me speak. The man looked down briefly. Not ashamed, just thoughtful. I think we did that earlier, he admitted. His honesty surprised me. Yes, I said calmly. But what matters is what happens after awareness. He nodded slowly. That makes sense. We stood there quietly for a moment. Then he said something that shifted the emotional tone again. I don't want to be the kind of person who dismisses others, he said. His voice sounded sincere. But sometimes, I don't know when I'm doing it. That vulnerability felt real, and it mattered. Awareness isn't about being perfect, I said gently. It's about being willing to learn. His wife nodded. I think today has been eye-opening. She looked around the museum differently now, slower, more intentional. I used to think museums were just collections of facts, she added. But now it feels like stories finally being told. I smiled. That's exactly what they are. A museum staff member walked past, nodding at me with recognition. The man noticed. You come here often? He asked. Yes, I said. It reminds me where we've been and where we're going. He nodded slowly, and then he said something that surprised even him. I'm glad you didn't just walk away when we made those comments earlier. I hesitated. That wasn't easy, I admitted. Why not? The wife asked. Because it's tiring, I said honestly. Explaining your existence over and over. They both grew quiet again. The weight of that statement settled between us, and I could see understanding forming, not intellectually, but emotionally, which is where real change begins. The man looked back at my grandfather's photograph across the room. "I think I understand something now," he said slowly. "What?" I asked. "We weren't just dismissing history earlier," he said. "We were dismissing people." The words landed deeply, and in that moment, I knew the lesson had reached its heart, but it wasn't finished yet, because the most powerful realization was still coming. After he said, "We weren't just dismissing history. We were dismissing people," something settled into the space between us. Not tension, not discomfort. Something deeper. Recognition. And recognition is powerful because once someone truly sees something, they can't go back to not seeing it. We stood quietly for a moment. The museum lights reflected softly against the glass displays, and I noticed how different the room felt now compared to when this started. Earlier, their voices had carried certainty. Now their silence carried reflection. The man leaned back slightly, folding his hands together. "I think," he began, then stopped, searching for the right words. "I think I've spent most of my life believing history was neutral." I nodded slowly. "That's a common assumption." "But it's not, is it?" he asked. "No," I said gently. "History is written by people, and people have perspectives." His wife exhaled slowly, almost like she had been holding her breath. "I feel embarrassed," she admitted. Her voice sounded vulnerable now, stripped of the earlier confidence. I shook my head lightly. "Embarrassment isn't the goal." "What is?" she asked. "Understanding," I said. She nodded slowly. And then, something unexpected happened. She stepped closer to another display, one focused on early civil rights activism, and began reading carefully, almost reverently. Her body language had changed completely. No crossed arms, no defensive posture, just curiosity. The man followed beside her. "You know," he said quietly, "earlier I thought you were just arguing with us." I smiled faintly. "I wasn't arguing." "What were you doing?" he asked. "Inviting you to see differently." He laughed softly. "Well, it worked." But this wasn't the climax yet. The real turning point came a few minutes later. A museum guide approached us again, the same woman who had checked in earlier. "Excuse me," she said politely, looking at me. I didn't want to interrupt earlier, but would you mind helping with a quick explanation for a school group? They're visiting the exhibit about your grandfather. The couple turned toward me immediately. Confusion flashed across their faces. "My grandfather?" the man repeated. I nodded slightly. "Yes." The guide smiled warmly. "He's one of our most important figures in this exhibit." The man blinked slowly. "You didn't say that," he said quietly. "I didn't think it mattered," I replied. But it did matter. I could see the realization forming. They had been speaking dismissively about an exhibit connected directly to my family. They had assumed I was just another visitor. And now, the entire perspective shifted. The guide led us toward a group of students, teenagers standing near the display, listening attentively. I spoke to them calmly, explaining the historical context, the challenges my grandfather faced, the innovations he helped create. The couple stood nearby, listening silently, and I felt their attention differently now. Not curiosity, respect. When I finished, one student raised her hand. "What made you want to share these stories?" she asked. I smiled gently. "Because history becomes real when we understand the people behind it." The students nodded. The guide thanked me warmly and led them away. When I turned back, the couple looked Different. Not uncomfortable, humbled. The man shook his head slowly. "I think I understand now," he said quietly. "What?" I asked. "Why you didn't get angry earlier," he said. I tilted my head slightly. "Why do you think?" "Because you didn't need to prove anything," he replied. The insight surprised me. "Yes," I said softly. He nodded. "And you gave us space to learn instead of making us feel attacked." His wife's eyes softened. "That made it easier to listen," she added. We walked slowly toward the exit together. The conversation felt lighter now, not because the topic lost weight, but because understanding replaced resistance. Before we reached the doors, the man stopped. "I want to say something," he said. I waited. "I came in today thinking I already understood history," he continued, "but I realize now I only knew part of it." He extended his hand. "Thank you for not walking away from us." I shook his hand gently. "You did the hard part," I said. "What's that?" "You stayed open." His wife smiled warmly. "I think this changed how we'll see things moving forward." "I hope so," I replied. They walked out of the museum slowly, talking quietly to each other. And I stayed behind for a moment, standing in the quiet again, thinking about how change doesn't come from humiliation. It comes from understanding. And sometimes, the strongest lesson isn't the loudest one. It's the one delivered with patience. After they walked out of the museum, I stayed behind for a while, not because I needed to, because I needed to think. The room felt quieter than before. Or maybe it just felt different because the energy had changed. Moments like that don't end the way movies suggest. There's no dramatic music, no applause, just silence. And in that silence, you replay everything. I walked slowly back toward my grandfather's exhibit. The photograph looked the same as it always had, frozen in time, calm, dignified. I stood in front of it longer than usual. "You would have liked that," I whispered under my breath. My grandfather used to believe that education was stronger than confrontation, not because confrontation never had a place, but because real change happens when someone reaches a conclusion themselves. He never argued to win. He explained to connect. Growing up, I didn't understand that. I thought strength meant being louder, faster, more forceful. But standing there in the museum that day, I realized something. Patience had more power than pride. I started walking again, letting my steps echo lightly against the polished floor. A museum employee passed by and smiled. "You always seem thoughtful when you leave," she said casually. I laughed softly. "History does that." She nodded knowingly and continued walking. I stopped near a bench and sat down, watching people move through the exhibits. A young couple reading together, an older man taking photos carefully, a child pointing excitedly at something his parent was explaining. And I thought about the couple I had just met. When they first spoke, their comments felt familiar. The kind of casual dismissiveness I'd encountered many times before. But something about today had been different. Maybe it was the setting. Maybe it was their willingness to stay instead of walk away. Or maybe I had changed because there was a time when I would have reacted differently. Years ago, moments like that made me defensive immediately. I would argue, raise my voice, try to prove something quickly. Every time I did, people stopped listening. Not because I was wrong, but because emotion made them feel attacked. And when people feel attacked, they protect their pride instead of examining their beliefs. That lesson didn't come easily. It came from failure, from conversations that went nowhere, from frustration, and from my grandfather, who once told me something I didn't appreciate until much later. He said, "Your goal isn't to win conversations. Your goal is to leave people thinking." Sitting on that bench, I realized that's exactly what had happened today. I hadn't changed their past. I hadn't erased their assumptions. But I had planted something. And sometimes, that's enough. A few minutes later, I stood up and began walking toward the exit. But before I reached the doors, I heard footsteps behind me. "Excuse me." I turned. It was the man from earlier. His wife stood beside him. They looked slightly breathless, like they had come back intentionally. "We were hoping you were still here," he said. I smiled lightly. "I am." His wife stepped forward. "We left, but we kept talking about everything," she said. Her voice carried a seriousness that felt deeper than before. "And?" I asked gently. She hesitated. "I think today changed something for us." The man nodded. I realized on the drive to the parking lot that I've spent years believing I was open-minded, he said. But being open-minded isn't just about intentions. It's about listening when you're uncomfortable. I didn't respond immediately, because that realization had to belong to him, not me. His wife continued. "I grew up thinking racism meant obvious hate," she said, "but now I see that assumptions can be just as harmful, even when they feel harmless." The honesty in her voice surprised me, not because people can't change, because admitting it out loud takes courage. "We wanted to thank you," the man said quietly, "for being patient with us." I nodded gently. "You were willing to listen," I said. "That matters." We stood there for a moment, the conversation softer now, less about correction and more about reflection. And then the man said something that stayed with me long after they left. "I don't think you just taught us about history today," he said. "You taught us how to learn." The words landed deeper than he probably realized, because that was exactly what my grandfather had tried to teach me. They smiled, thanked me again, and walked toward the exit. This time, when they left, I didn't feel unfinished. I felt peaceful, because I knew something had shifted, not dramatically, not instantly, but permanently. And as I stepped outside into the sunlight, I realized something else. The lesson wasn't just for them. It was for me too. Sometimes strength isn't about correcting people quickly. Sometimes it's about giving understanding enough space to grow. When they left for the second time, I didn't follow them. Not because I didn't care, but because the moment felt complete. There's a difference between ending a conversation and finishing a lesson. And that day, the lesson felt finished. I stood near the entrance for a few minutes, watching the doors close behind them as sunlight poured into the lobby. People moved in and out, each carrying their own stories, their own assumptions, their own opportunities to learn. I thought about how easily the day could have gone differently if I had ignored them completely, if I had reacted with anger instead of patience, if they had refused to listen. Any one of those things could have turned a meaningful moment into another forgotten argument. But instead, something shifted. And that shift stayed with me. I walked back through the exhibit slowly, retracing my steps from earlier. The same displays, the same photographs, but everything felt slightly different now. Not because the museum had changed, because I had. Standing in front of my grandfather's photograph again, I felt something settle inside me. A quiet understanding that the stories he told me as a child were never just about history. They were about responsibility. Responsibility to carry stories forward. Responsibility to meet ignorance with knowledge instead of bitterness. Responsibility to remember that most people don't start from understanding. they grow into it. I remembered something he used to say: patience doesn't mean weakness, it means strength without fear. As a kid, I thought that sounded poetic but unrealistic. Now I understood, because earlier that day I had watched two people confront ideas they had never questioned before, not because they were forced, because they were guided. I sat down on the same bench I had used earlier. The museum felt calmer now, less crowded. The late afternoon light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. A group of students passed by, laughing quietly. One of them stopped briefly in front of the exhibit, reading carefully before moving on. And I wondered how many small moments like that shape someone's understanding without them realizing it. That's the thing about learning. It rarely feels dramatic in the moment. But later, it changes how you see everything. I checked my phone. A message from my sister appeared. "How's the museum?" I smiled and typed back, "Unexpectedly meaningful." I didn't explain further. Some experiences are hard to summarize. I stood up and began walking toward the exit again. This time, I paused near the gift shop. Not because I wanted to buy anything, but because I noticed a book featuring my grandfather's work displayed prominently on a shelf. I picked it up gently, flipped through the pages. Photographs, documents, stories that once existed only in family conversations now printed for the world to see. And I thought about the couple again. Earlier that day, they saw this exhibit as unnecessary. Now, they left seeing it as essential. That shift wasn't magic. It wasn't sudden enlightenment. It was the result of conversation, of presence, of someone refusing to walk away. As I stepped toward the exit doors, I felt lighter, not triumphant, just peaceful. Because moments like that remind me why history matters, not as a collection of dates, but as a bridge between people. Outside, the air felt warmer than before. The city noise returned, cars passing, conversations overlapping, life moving forward. I walked slowly down the steps, taking a deep breath. And that's when something unexpected happened. I heard footsteps behind me. "Hey," I turned. It wasn't the couple. It was the young boy from earlier, the one who had pointed excitedly at the exhibit. He ran toward me, his mother following behind with an apologetic smile. "Sorry," she said. "He insisted on coming back." The boy looked up at me, eyes wide with excitement. "Are you really related to the guy inside?" I laughed softly. "Yes, I am." "That's so cool," he said. "He looks like me." The words hit deeper than he realized. "Yes," I said gently. "He does." The boy grinned. "I want to invent something someday, too." His mother smiled proudly. "I told him he can be anything," I nodded. "He absolutely can." They waved goodbye and walked away. And in that moment, I understood something powerful. The lesson that day wasn't just for the couple. It wasn't even just for me. It was for everyone who walked through those doors. Each person carrying assumptions, each person capable of change. As I turned to leave, I realized the most important truth of all. Change doesn't always come from big speeches or dramatic moments. Sometimes, it comes from one conversation, one choice to stay instead of walk away, one decision to teach instead of react. And that realization stayed with me long after I left the museum. When I stepped away from the museum that day, I didn't feel like I had won anything. That's important to say, because people often imagine moments like that as victories, like debates you walk away from feeling triumphant. But it didn't feel like that at all. It felt quiet, thoughtful, almost humbling. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the sidewalk as I walked slowly toward the street. The sounds of the city wrapped around me again. Distant conversations, footsteps, the low hum of passing cars, life moving forward. I stopped for a moment at the bottom of the museum steps and looked back. The building stood tall and calm behind me, holding thousands of stories within its walls. Stories of struggle, stories of brilliance, stories that waited patiently for someone willing to see them fully. And I realized something. The real lesson of that day wasn't about changing someone else. It was about choosing how I showed up. Years ago, I might have reacted differently. I might have raised my voice, defended myself, tried to win the argument quickly. And maybe I would have felt justified. But nothing would have changed. Because when people feel attacked, they protect their identity instead of questioning their beliefs. That's something my grandfather understood long before I did. I remembered sitting beside him as a child, listening to stories about moments when he faced rejection, dismissal, and quiet prejudice. He never described those moments with anger. He described them with patience, not passive patience, active patience, the kind that chooses understanding over reaction. Back then, I thought that meant he accepted injustice. Now I understood. He wasn't accepting it. He was transforming it. One conversation at a time. I walked toward a nearby park bench and sat down, letting the events of the day replay in my mind. The couple's first comments, the dismissive tone, the assumptions, and then the slow shift, the questions, the listening, the realization. Change didn't happen in one moment. It happened through small steps. And that's how real growth works. Not sudden, gradual, human. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through old photos until I found one of my grandfather, standing proudly beside a project he helped build. His expression looked calm, steady, confident, without arrogance. I smiled softly. "You were right," I whispered quietly, because he had always told me something I didn't fully understand until now. People rarely change because you defeat them. They change because you invite them. I sat there for a long time, thinking about that. Thinking about how easy it would be to assume the couple was beyond learning, how easy it would be to walk away and label them permanently. But labels don't create growth. Conversations do. Eventually, I stood up and began walking again. The city felt different. Not because it had changed, but because my perspective had shifted slightly. And as I crossed the street, I noticed something small but meaningful. A poster for the museum exhibit displayed in a nearby window. My grandfather's photograph printed alongside other innovators, publicly recognized, visible, permanent. I watched a young man stop and look at the poster carefully. He studied it for a moment, then took a photo before walking away. And I wondered what story he carried with him now. What perspective had shifted for him? Because that's the thing about representation. It doesn't just change history. It changes how people imagine themselves inside it. As I continued walking, I thought about the boy from earlier, the excitement in his voice when he said, "He looks like me." That moment stayed with me the most. Because change doesn't always look like arguments ending. Sometimes it looks like a child seeing possibility for the first time. Maybe that was the real lesson. Not proving someone wrong, but creating space for someone new to see themselves differently. The sky began turning orange as the sun lowered. I slowed my pace, letting the day settle inside me. There was no dramatic ending, no perfect resolution, just understanding. And sometimes, understanding is enough. Before heading home, I stopped one last time and looked back toward the direction of the museum. And I realized something I hadn't fully understood until that moment. The couple didn't just learn about history that day. They learned about humility, about listening, about seeing people instead of assumptions. But I learned something too. Strength isn't always loud. Sometimes strength is calm. Sometimes strength is patience. Sometimes strength is choosing to teach when walking away would be easier. And as I finally turned toward home, one thought stayed with me more than anything else. The most powerful lessons are rarely the ones shouted. They're the ones that change how someone sees the world long after the conversation ends.